As businesses around the world buckle in and brace themselves for the impact that the coronavirus pandemic will have on their operations, proper crisis management has become a necessity for company leadership. Yet only 54% of companies have a crisis plan in place. One of the most important actions that business leaders can take in the event of a global crisis event like COVID-19 is to quickly implement a plan to communicate company-wide updates. That's why Beekeeper prepared a general list of internal communication tips to help you effectively communicate with your team during a crisis situation. Download Beekeeper's free crisis communications checklist today at www.beekeeper.io/crisisavertedpodcast. That's www.beekeeper.io/crisisavertedpodcast. Welcome to the Crisis Averted Podcast, produced by CJ Media Solutions. I'm your host, CJ Arlotta. In this episode, I speak with Maryland Governor Larry Hogan. During our conversation, he provides insight into how he, as the governor of Maryland, prepares for crises and reveals some of the biggest missteps leaders make when responding to crises. Feel free to send me your feedback at cj@cjmediasolutionsllc.com. Oh, and if you're listening to the Crisis Averted Podcast on Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating, review, or both. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Governor Hogan, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Hey, thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
So I wanted to have you on the podcast because you've faced many crises in your life. At one point, you had financial problems due to a failing business. You ran for governor as a Republican in a heavily blue state, a race you won. Then there were the Baltimore riots in 2015 while you were governor. And shortly after being elected governor, you learned that you had a highly aggressive form of late-stage cancer, which you beat. Having said all that, which have been more challenging for you, the personal or professional crises you faced over the years?
Well, it's an interesting question. None of them were a lot of fun, but I can tell you that I learned a whole lot more going through those times of crisis and adversity than I did during times when things were going really well. Certain things, I came into office, I was elected in this bluest state in America as a Republican, and I had a good plan on what I wanted to do with the state to try to turn our economy around and put people back to work and help grow small businesses, and all that was planned out. These other things, life is going to happen like that, where things hit you from out of the blue. I wasn't expecting 89 days after being sworn in to have our largest city in flames with the worst violence in 47 years. And we had to step up and deal with that crisis. And then 60 days later, I got hit with this pretty scary news that I had very aggressive advanced cancer that spread all over my body, and, had some pretty scary odds, and went through 6 months of 24-hour-a-day chemotherapy. So I think the personal challenges were hard to overcome, but I was really more focused on the other things, and quite frankly, this most recent challenge of dealing with COVID and trying to keep our economy going and try to keep the people safe. That I was in one case, I was only worried about keeping the city of Baltimore safe during rioting, and the other case, it was just my own personal life that was at stake, and some of the cancer patients that I got to meet. But this time I was worried about 6 million people and how to keep them, from getting sick and dying, and also try to keep them, moving forward, economically, and help people that really needed help.
Do you have a different process for handling personal crises than you do for crises you deal with as governor?
I'm not sure I do. I just try to tackle things, I like to make decisions after getting all the best information. And so in my personal crisis of, say, dealing with this cancer, I listened to the advice of the doctors and the professionals and did everything they told me. And I wasn't really worried about, am I going to, die or not, or am I going to survive this thing? I was focused on, what do we have to do? Let's get this done. And the first thing I was, I had to talk to my family, I had to talk to my staff and my cabinet, and then I had to explain it to the people of Maryland as directly and honestly as I could. On these other crises, same thing. I listened to the best experts and people with the best advice I could possibly find, and then made quick decisions and just came up with a plan and acted. That's what we did during the riots. That's what we did when we had the global pandemic that hit our state and, started overwhelming our hospitals. And it was, I just think surrounding yourself with the best advice and experts and best team around you, and then listening to them and not hesitating to take action. I think that's true whether it's a personal crisis or a business crisis or a state crisis or a global crisis like the one we're in right now.
Where did you learn how to overcome crisis? Did your father have anything to do with it? I know you were close with him, and he actually found himself in a tough situation during the Watergate scandal, if I remember correctly, when he, as a Republican member of Congress, called for the impeachment and removal of the president.
Well, I learned a heck of a lot about my dad, about integrity and public service from him. I think and I'm very proud to be his son. It was a very difficult choice. He was a guy who supported President Nixon and campaigned with him, and then, but after he saw the evidence, he really believed that he was guilty and had to make a tough decision about, not what his personal feelings were or not party loyalty, but really what was the right decision for the country. So I learned a lot about that. But I think, the decision making, I've been in business for 40 years. And as you mentioned, I went through some difficult financial times, and I saw lots of other friends and clients and associates who did as well. But I made a lot of decisions that I've certainly made a lot more of them now that I've been governor that have more consequences to more people. And really in this most recent thing in the past 6 months, we were making hundreds and hundreds of decisions that I never imagined having to make. But I think it's a combination of just my whole life background of overcoming adversity and making decisions in a crisis. It's just something I've gradually gotten better at.
In your book titled Still Standing, which I believe came out this past summer, you stress the importance of surrounding yourself with the best people you can find when you're in a leadership position. You even mentioned that briefly before. What should leaders look for when building a team? What are some of the qualities you look for in people? And has your perspective on this topic changed as you've gone through crises?
Well, it's an excellent question. I really, as I mentioned earlier, I really do believe, I think one of the things that I'm pretty good at, I don't have all the skills in the world, but I'm good. I'm a good judge of people, and I try to just look at what kinds of people, what are their talents and skills, and how could they contribute, and where do they fit into the team? Much like if you're putting a football team together, it's what skills do they have? But I'm looking for loyalty and smarts and people that aren't afraid to speak up and disagree with you and tell you exactly what they think. I don't like yes men. I like to have people saying exactly what they think, and I really listen. So I want to surround myself with the smartest people who are unafraid to kind of push back and argue with their teammates sometimes, because that diversity of opinion helps me make decisions. And I think that's important no matter what business you're in or what. I think you're only as good as the people that surround you, and that's how we successfully dealt with the riots in Baltimore. That's how we've done a pretty good job of battling this virus, and it's how we're doing much better economically than most of the rest of the country, because we just have really great people that are working hard every day and working around the clock and giving really good advice.
And it's tough to judge how someone in a position of power leads when things are going well, right? Oftentimes we see business executives and government officials fall short when they're eventually faced with adversity. So how can someone in a position of power prepare for handling crises? Is there anything you do or have done to always be prepared for a pending crisis? And how are you constantly testing your abilities to face crises when they arise?
Well, so I think, as I mentioned, many of the things we talked about already, I think having a great team around you helps you deal with the crisis. You have to be able to be willing to get that information and make quick decisions. When there's a crisis going on, all of the decision-making process is really sped up dramatically. In other words, we had to make decisions that were going to affect people's lives, and we had to make them immediately, sometimes, on the spot. And normally in a business process, you do, I'm very good also at doing strategic planning, really forward thinking, laying out a plan, a 90-day plan, a 6-month plan, a 3-year plan, 5-year plan. But no matter what business you're in or what job you're in, you're going to be hit with things from out of the blue that you did not plan for, that you're not expecting, that sometimes are either, life-threatening, or they may threaten your business, things that out of your control. And I think you have to be able to get the information and act. I think one of the biggest mistakes people can make is hesitation and not making the decisions. And it is different in a crisis than normally. You want to have a well thought out, deliberative process. Sometimes in a crisis, you have to go with your gut and get the input, but make those kind of fast, fired off decisions. I think that's one of the hardest things.
So, how do you assess whether or not you need more information to make a decision?
Well, that's a tough one. I try not to get too much information, so I'm bogged down, and it's a kind of a paralysis, by analysis, and you spend too much time just pouring through documents and questioning back and forth. But I want to get the pertinent information and get the smartest people who know the subject matter best and ask their opinions. What do you think we should do and why? What do you think and why? And then I just listen to all of that, and I go through the most pertinent facts, boil it down, and try to get to a yes or no, or a act or don't act, or take path A versus path B as quickly as you can.
Now, during the Baltimore riots in 2015, you made it a point to go to Freddie Gray's neighborhood and meet with members of the community and community leaders. In your book, you share the concerns residents had, many of which had to do with policing. But you told residents at the time that what needed to be dealt with first was the immediate crisis. When you're faced with several crises at once, what's the best way to prioritize them? And how do you do it in a way that ensures stakeholder concerns are addressed, even if you plan on tackling them somewhere down the line?
Well, that's a perfect example. And during the riots in Baltimore, so this just happened very quickly after the death of Freddie Gray. It was after Ferguson, then next was Baltimore. It was kind of the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, and really a lot of concern in the community, and it flared up into, pretty serious violence. And so our immediate action was we had to stop the violence and keep the people safe. Keep peaceful protesters safe and keep the citizens safe. The city of Baltimore and their police force was overwhelmed, and I had to act within just a matter of hours to send in 1,000 extra police officers and 4,000 members of the guard. It was quite the mobilization. I had to make 100 quick decisions in just a very short period of time. But I also thought it was, once we immediately put the fires out and stopped the burning and looting and the injuring of people, that we had to address the longer term problems. And so I wanted people to know, part of my job was not only being the commander in chief to send in the troops, but also to be the consoler in chief and to try to let people know that things were going to be okay and let them know that we were going to listen to their concerns. So while all of the other things were going on, I was also walking the streets of Baltimore for a solid week, meeting with community leaders and faith-based leaders and local elected officials, and walked through Freddie Gray's neighborhood and talked to his neighbors. And I tried to lower the temperature and also let them know that, yes, there are some major underlying problems that need to be addressed, and in committing to them, we were going to focus on them. But I said, before we can address all these long-term underlying problems of the city of Baltimore, first thing we have to do is you have to help me stop the violence and return to some normalcy, and then we can focus on it. So I think you have to deal with the immediate. On the most recent COVID crisis, my immediate concern was we were trying to save people's lives and in our nursing homes and the most vulnerable populations and keep our hospitals from overflowing. And then long term, we had to figure out about how to help our businesses survive and get people back to work and keep people safe and do testing and contact tracing. So I just focus on the thing that's the most critical and most urgent. I mean, sometimes really important things are not the most urgent. And so you have to deal with the things that are right in front of you that need to be dealt with fast. And then you can work on the longer term problems.
Now, sticking with the same topic, the Baltimore riots in 2015, if I remember correctly, you and the mayor of Baltimore didn't see eye to eye on the best way to govern during that particular crisis. So what are some strategies leaders can use to work with others who may disagree on the best approach to overcoming a crisis?
Well, so that's, you're right. At the beginning of this crisis in Baltimore, the city was pretty much overwhelmed and paralyzed in what I was talking earlier about not making decisions and not taking actions. And I didn't want to have to step in, but we were in a situation where the city of Baltimore was crying out for leadership, and we had to step in. And I had to declare a state of emergency, and the state had to come in we tried to back up the city police and work together with the city, but we had to make the decision to act. And we said, well, look, we're going to give you all the support you need, but we can't continue to allow the city to burn down. And we let them be on the front lines, and then the state police backed up the city police, and then the National Guard backed up the state police. And we let people peacefully protest for a solid week, but we lowered the temperature and we immediately stopped all the violence. And that's, I think, what was missing in some of the demonstrations we've seen around the country because of failure to act and make those decisions in our most recent past after the tragic death of George Floyd. But we've tried to be very collaborative with our, on the crisis. I was leading the nation's governors, chairman of the NGA. We were trying to work collaboratively with the federal government and with our local partners, because we're all in these things together usually. And so it takes the federal, state, and local governments working together with our leaders in the private sector. We've all got to figure out how to solve these problems. And sometimes it's a little bit of a figuring out who has to be in charge of the problem and who's responsible for what.
As you know, successful leaders are able to communicate effectively, especially during times of crisis. But sometimes, even for great leaders, it's challenging to break bad news clearly, concisely, and directly. And I know you struggled with telling your wife about having late-stage, potentially deadly cancer. Talk a little bit about what was going through your head and how you prepared yourself and your wife for that conversation.
Well, so I got this diagnosis, and these doctors came in and told me some pretty scary news about 50 or 60 tumors all over my body, and what I might be faced with. And my first thought was, it was Father's Day weekend. It was Friday before Father's Day, and I knew I had to go home and explain it to my wife and my 3 daughters and my dad and my brothers, who were all getting together. And then that was very difficult. And then immediately after that, I had to tell the lieutenant governor, who might have to step up, and my key staff. But I also, against the advice of some of my communications experts, said I want to communicate clearly with the people and tell them exactly what I'm going through. And I was as transparent as possible. It's the same thing that we were doing with the riots in Baltimore. I tried to be out there telling people we were going to keep them safe. These are the actions we're taking. During COVID, I had to deliver bad news, but I also had to give them hope that things were going to be okay and that we were going to get it under control. And I think honesty and there's no such thing as over communicating. Letting people, even no matter how bad the news is, if you communicate to them, this is what's going on, and tell them that we're working on it. We have the best people on it, and we do have a plan, and we're going to go after this, and we're going to keep updating you as things change. I think people appreciate that transparency.
Now, of course, we talked a little bit about this before. The COVID-19 pandemic is on everybody's mind, right? That's one of the more recent crises you've had to deal with as governor. What have been some of the lessons you've learned with dealing with a global pandemic? Did you have to throw out the playbook on this one, or did you use what you learned from dealing with crises in the past?
Well, there really was no playbook for this. Although since I've been governor for nearly 6 years now, we had done, through our emergency management teams and our health department teams, we had been doing tabletop exercises for 6 years about what happens in the event of a pandemic, and specifically respiratory viruses, because, we had dealt with this scares a number of times that we thought might come to our shores, and luckily we dodged the bullet, but nothing really could prepare us for the way this crisis rapidly moved. I don't know that the federal government or the state governments or any of our hospital systems or anybody was really prepared the way we should be, and hopefully we will be next time. But we also, I was leading the governors, and so I led 50-some Zoom calls with all of the governors across America, 30-some of them with the president and vice president and the coronavirus task force, the cabinet, and all of us were sort of trying to make daily decisions, and sometimes getting into pushing back about, hey, we need more help on this, or are we doing this as governors, or are you doing this as the federal government? And we had those same collaborative conversations with our local leaders, and so trying to get everybody to share the information, to communicate more, and to come up with clear lines about who's going to do what. The governors happen to be on the front lines of this, but we really needed the help and the backing of the federal government. And then we had to get everything distributed out through our local governments as well.
In general, what are usually some of the biggest missteps leaders make when responding to a crisis? What would you share with an incoming governor about the topic?
Well, it's funny. I joked right after the riots in Baltimore, I said they don't really teach a course at new governor school about what to do right after you're sworn in if your largest city is on fire. But then they asked me to actually do a course to teach new governors about how to deal with a crisis, and I shared some of those thoughts. But some of it I mentioned earlier. Have your team in place as quickly as possible. Like, some of these guys were just trying to find where the restrooms were in their building and just hadn't unpacked the things in their office yet, and they were in the middle of this crisis. So we had to hire really smart people. They had to be ramped up and ready to go, and their teams ready to go and up to speed. But it really got back to you can't hesitate in a moment of crisis. Get the right team around you, listen to their advice, and then act and make decisions. And sometimes you have to make those decisions in hours, in some cases minutes. You can't really take months to study it. You can't put together a work group or a task force and say, get back to me in 90 days and let me know. It's like, we have to know right now before we get off this phone call or before we get up from this table. And we're going to have to make decisions that impact people's lives.
Governor Hogan, thanks for joining me on the podcast today. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.